if they start saying, hey, is this a good price for this? Should I get, like, can you run some comps for me? Can you go and look at it and give me a video tour? When you start doing research for a particular property and helping that client for a particular property, that is when the agency is triggered. And that's when a contract needs to be signed. So for sure, if you go and show a house, that needs to be signed. Hey guys, it's Brittany. I'm a real estate agent, coach, and investor, and I'm here to make real estate easy for you. And every Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I do just that. I bring you a weekly workshop where you can come live, ask your questions. We do hands-on training that are designed to help you move your business forward. I am a productivity coach, and that's exactly what I try to do. I help get you into production. I want to make sure you're getting the best value out of this, so join me every Monday where you can catch us live. So right now, let's jump into this week's topic. Welcome. So today we're talking about crafting contracts. We're going to focus on the BRBC. It is 2 o'clock, so I want to get started, but as people trickle in, that's okay too. We can welcome them as they come. And we're gonna have lots of questions today, and that is perfect. That's exactly what we want today in this conversation. So this is something that we have been talking about for a long time. You've probably just like heard it beaten to death in your brokerages and in your conference rooms and training rooms. And so this is just one more time where we're coming at it, hopefully with, from a different angle and talking about something different. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through step by step of filling out the BRBC and a couple of different forms that are similar to the BRBC. So we're talking all about buyer representation and getting that buyer rep agreement signed. So we're doing the BRBC, we're doing the, well, I'll tell you about it when we get there. But as a disclaimer, I am not a trainer of the forms. I am not a teacher of these things. This is just me as I'm seeing it. I'm hearing all of the trainings that I go through, and I'm just coming and bringing it to you. At the end of this, I want to talk through how I would talk about this with my clients. So I want you to ask some questions and bring them to me. And if you have heard different things or maybe some common pushback on this that you're getting or you're hearing other people getting, bring it to me. I want to talk about it. Let's talk through it, because by the end of this, I want you feeling a lot more comfortable about being able to talk about this with your clients. So we're going to talk about the BRBC, the PSRA, which is another form for buyer representation, and it is basically just saying it's a much more limited BRBC. I've heard this referred to as the BRBC Lite. This is just 3 properties, and that is what it is. So it's a shorter version. The OHNA, which is for open houses, and then the SP, which is a single property contract. So let's jump in to the BRBC, because that's the biggest one. And I'm going to share my screen. You guys can fill this out with me as we go. So first and foremost, what I want to point out to you is that when I open, so I already have the buyer representation agreement open, but on the side here, let me move this out of the way. On the side here, I have pulled up all the forms that we're going to talk about. So when you see this, you're going to see that I have a lot of pages that you're not necessarily going to have. So don't worry about that. But when we pull up the BRBC, in the BRBC bundle, there is this first page called the AD. You're going to see this when you do an RPA. You're going to see this when you do an RLA, the listing agreement. You're going to see this when you do the BRBC, the buyer rep agreement, the offer, all kinds of things, because basically it's really spelling out the agency relationship. Now, this is not a new form. You can see it was revised in 2021. So this is not a new form, although they're still tacking it on all of these documents. It's in all of these bundles. So what we're going to do, remember, we're representing the buyer as we fill this out. So we are going to have buyer Brenda. She's going to be filling out this, and she is buying this alone, so we don't have to fill the rest of this out. Now you can see that some of this is already filled out for us, and that's because I've done it already in my templates. And I tell you all the time, a quick, easy trick is to be sure that you go through. There is a little tab that says templates. If you go and edit your templates, all of this is going to be much easier. You can fill out all of this information that you typically have, and you don't have to fill it out again. So you want to make sure that you are doing your templates. Okay, so the question of how to do it on your templates, I will go through after this because I don't have it open right now. So after this, make sure to remind me to go on the templates and I will show you how to do it. It's exactly the same thing. It's just in your templates. And so you're filling it out in your templates. And so basically the next time you go to fill it out, this will all be filled out for you. So right now when we fill this out, what you'll notice is that once we put in your buyer brokerage, and of course you're going to be putting in whatever your buyer brokerage is. Mine would be Keller Williams, West Ventura County, your brokerage DRE, your name, and then your DRE number. So once you put all of these in, these are on all kinds of forms. You're going to want that in. You don't want to have to do that over and over and over again. So make sure you put this in your templates. And again, we'll go over that at the end or after we do these forms. But for now, I'm just going to write in buyer brokerage, buyer DRE. I want you to figure out what all these are and then put them in your templates. But what you'll see is that for like buyer Brenda, we're only going to have to fill this out one time. And then for the rest of the forms in your transaction, it's already going to be on here. Buyer Brenda is already going to be on here. And everything else we fill out. Every time it has buyer 1, buyer Brenda is going to be filled out. So as we go through, we can see. All right, so here we are already to the BRBC, and you always want to make sure that you're using the most updated version. So right now we're on, this was updated July of 2024. If you have anything that was dated before that, you don't want to use it because it has been changed so much. You always want to stay on the most recent form. So just before I jump in, I want to preface this by saying I'm not going to go through the entire BRBC and read every line of it. That's your job. That's for you to do. You need to make sure that you're reading through everything and understanding everything. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you kind of an overview and then show you how we're filling this out. So first of all, what we're going to see is that it's in a grid just like a lot of our forms are turning into. Our RLA, our RPA already has a grid. Now this BRBC has a grid. It actually makes it much easier to fill out and much easier to walk through with your clients. It makes it so that they can understand it. I think it's a little more clear. I think actually it's a lot more clear and more helpful. So if you're new to this, you're in luck because you're learning it the new way. You don't have to unlearn something else. But basically with this grid that we're looking at, you have these identifiers on the side. So you're going to say number 1, part A, A1, A2, B, B1, B2, etc. And then this over here, this is going to say where the explanation of this is. It's going to be in paragraph 4B. So if we're looking at this and saying the type of representation, non-exclusive or exclusive, I don't really know what that means. Let me read a little bit more. Let's go to 4B. So here we are in 4, compensation to brokers, 4B, broker right to compensation. And then you can read through all right here. So like I said, it's really helpful because you can see it's just this that you have to fill out. The rest of it is going to be explanation for your buyer. So your client, if they have any questions, are going to be able to read through at the bottom. If you have any questions, be sure you're reading through at the bottom too. But before you do anything, you want to read through this entire document. Anytime you're having a client sign a document, you want to make sure you read through the entire thing before you're asking them to sign. Okay, first and foremost, you want to write the date prepared. That's going to be the date that you're filling this out and or you're presenting to your buyer. It's different from the signed date. So the signed date, that's when your agreement actually takes effect, is when it's signed. However, when you refer back to this in subsequent documents like addendums and other documents, it's going to say this refers back to the BRBC dated, and it's going to be this date prepared. So that's why this date prepared is important, and it may or may not be different from the date signed. Okay, first things first, remember we said this buyer, Brenda, and brokerage are already in here because we filled it out at the top. So everywhere it has buyer one or brokerage, it's going to already put it in there. So makes our job much easier. So starting with this representation period, notice that it says not to exceed 3 months. If representation period exceeds 3 months, this agreement is void unless buyer is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. So we want to make sure that we're doing it for less than 3 months, although I would say I want it to be for 3 months because 3 months is not very long. And so I want to make sure that I'm doing this for as long as possible. So if I'm filling it out today, then I want to say that I'm going to do this for 3 months, 1, 2, 3, and today's the 15th. To be sure that I'm not, to be sure that we're falling in compliance, I'm going to do it for the day before, just to be sure, because if it's 1 day over, then it's going to be void, and I don't want it to be void. Now, if you need to modify this in any way, there is a document called modification of terms. You can fill that out. You can also just do an addendum and extend this. You can have them fill out a new one. There are ways to extend this timeline, and I hope that as things change and as these documents are starting to actually get in use, they're going to realize that 3 months is really not long enough. The reason they've done this and limit it to such a short amount of time is because there was a broker or an agent in Florida or somewhere else, not in California, that they were taking advantage of people. They were basically signing elderly people up to like a 60-year representation period for a listing, and then they were putting a lien on their house if they tried to sell with somebody else so that they were getting the money for it or whatever. So they're trying to combat that, but I feel like they've gone a little too far because 3 months is not very long, especially when you're representing a buyer. So I feel like we're going to see that change coming up here in the future. Okay. Type of representation, it defaults to non-exclusive, but I don't know about you. I want to make sure that I have exclusive representation as much as possible. So I'm going to change in my templates to check this box for exclusive. So make sure that you are doing that, because if it's non-exclusive, that means that you're saying, hey, you're agreeing to work with me, but not exclusively. So if you walk into an open house and that agent helps you write an offer, I don't need to get paid. That agent is who's going to get paid. You don't want that. You want to make sure that you are in an exclusive agreement. Now, if you meet somebody at an open house or, from an online lead or something like that, and you don't know them from Adam, and they say, why would I sign an exclusive agreement with you? I don't want to do that. Well, there are other documents that you can sign that are non-exclusive and that are for shorter times and that are for instances just like that. In my opinion, the BRBC, you really want to default to exclusive. And so I'm going to use this BRBC for my exclusive clients, the ones that I'm working with exclusively. And even if I'm doing one of those single property showings or one of those other documents, those expire much sooner. And so at some point I'm going to say, okay, let's sit down, have a listing, have a buyer have a buyer presentation. And then at that point, we're going to agree to work exclusively together. So I'm going to give them a little bit of time to work with me, to learn that, they want to use me, of course. And then we're going to sit down and sign an actual BRBC that's an exclusive agreement. If after all that, they still don't want to work with me exclusively, you know what? That tells me that they're not willing to commit and be loyal to me. So I'm not willing to commit and be loyal to them, is the reality of it. And so I want to make sure that the people I'm working with are going to be committed and loyal to me. And of course, you're an independent contractor. You can make your own rules when it comes to that. And your brokers are all going to come up with their own rules. So you want to make sure that you're falling under whatever your broker says. So we have the NAR guidelines, and then we have the CAR guidelines, which are for California. And then we have our board, our local board, and then we have our broker. And so what our broker says is really what we need to stand behind, because our brokers are looking at what our personal E&O insurance covers, what their office is willing to cover, what they're willing to stand behind. And so we need to really make sure that we're protecting ourselves from liability and going with whatever our broker says. So if I ever say anything different from what your broker says, default to what they say. Okay, so now we go down here to property type. So property type defaults to single family residential, including condominium and manufactured homes. So basically you're saying we're looking for a typical home, condo, manufactured home, whatever. If they're looking for a multifamily, up to 4 units, a 5 or more units, something like that, then we want to check these off. So we want to make sure that we know what they're looking for. And if they're looking for vacant land, whatever, we're going to check these off. So we're still going to use the same form, but we're going to be more specific about it. But the default is single family residential, so you don't have to put anything here. Okay, now the location. I like to put a couple of different counties, because if you're anything like me, I go where the business is. And so sometimes I'm in Ventura County, LA County, Santa Barbara County, and I don't want my clients to drive 20 minutes and say, oh, well, I didn't think you worked there because you didn't list it. So I want to list it in all these different counties. I don't want to be narrowing myself and my business. So I'm going to say right here, Ventura, Los Angeles, Santa Barbara. Some agents I know say anywhere in California. Some agents say Southern California, all of that. Because it specifically says counties, that's why I'm putting the names of these counties. They're getting more and more specific, so I just want to make sure that I'm covering my bases. So I specifically am putting counties. Then we go down here to additional buyer preferences and priorities. There is another form called the BIPP or the BIP. I don't know what we're calling it. And it's specifically talking about their buyer preferences, priorities. And so this would be where they say, I want a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home. I want it to be under this price point and all of that. Well, if you've been doing this for any length of time, you know that buyers change their minds all the time. They have no idea what they want. It changes so much from when they first start looking. So this form is not locking you in. This form is really just saying, okay, here's what we're talking about. We're both in agreement to this. And it's just making sure that we both understand we're on the same page. It's a form that really just stays in your files. It's not required for anything. It's totally optional. So you can fill this out and you don't have to. Properties excluded from representation. This would be any properties that they're working with another agent on. So if, for instance, they went to an open house and that agent is helping, helped them with a couple other properties, or they did a showing with them a few more times, or they sent them some information or different things like that. If they did those things, then those properties might be excluded. This is if they've signed an agreement with another agent for another property. So for instance, the next document that we'll see is the property showing and representation agreement, which is specific to a few different properties. And so if they signed that for, 3 properties, then those 3 properties would be excluded from your agreement. So hopefully that's not the case, but that's where you would put that. And again, it's so everybody is on the up and up and everybody understands. If you help them, if they end up buying that house that is on the excluded list, you are not getting paid. So keep that in mind. Now here's where we start to have this compensation agreement, conversation. And so this compensation is always negotiable, always and has forever been negotiable. But this is where the conversation started. This is where the NAR settlement came from, is from the buyer agent compensation. So traditionally, historically, in the past, what it's been, remember, it's always been negotiable. However, sellers got together and said, hey, it's not fair that I have to pay the buyer's agent representation when I don't get to choose that. I don't have any say in it. Why should I be the one paying it? And so now the courts said, you're right, we agree with you. And so now what it is that the buyer has to pay their own compensation. The listing agent pays the the listing agent is paid by the seller and the buyer's agent is paid by the buyer. Now, what that means still is that the seller can still choose to give a credit or to give compensation to the buyer's agent, but they're understanding that that's going to be a credit. They're understanding that they are agreeing to pay for that. It's not required. It's not necessary. It's not, we don't know if it's going to be common or the norm or whatever. One of the things that cannot be done is price fixing. So, you know, a group of agents can't get together and say, well, we're only going to work if we're offered a commission. You can't do that. And so, so it's another reason why I can't come up here and say, well, this is how much compensation you should do. There is no set compensation there. It's always and forever negotiable. So whatever your compensation. We'll jump back into the workshop in just a minute, but if you're getting value out of this, be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in getting a real estate freebie, click on the link below and submit your contact info, and I'll send you out something that's guaranteed to move your business forward. In the meantime, let's jump back into the video. Is whatever that price is, let's say 45%. It's not going to be 45% probably because that's a little outlandish, but let's just say that for kicks and giggles. And the acquisition, 45% of the acquisition price and any dollar amount. So that would be like my office charges administrative fees for closings. And so that would, you know, if I wanted to pass that on to my client, I could write that in here. You don't have to. Or an attached compensation schedule. This is like if you did, I don't know, kind of weird things. Like these are things that are not typical. So I won't even go into it. We've always had them, but it's not typical, and you can look into that further. So this next part of here says payments received by broker from seller or others. If broker receives compensation from seller or others for broker representation of the buyer, the amount shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1, which is right here. So what this is saying is that the buyer is agreeing that you, as the agent and your broker, are entitled to receive those funds. So whether they're paid for by the broker, whether they're paid for by the seller, whether they're paid in, you know, through escrow, whatever it is, your seller or your buyer is going to be paying you. And this is just saying that they're agreeing to that. Continued right to payment for the broker involved properties. So this is saying like the continuation period. So if you're helping them and you're close to finding something and this expires, you still have whatever days you write in here. So let's just put 30 days. You could put 90 days. You could put 15 days, whatever you wanted to put. Cancellation rights and notice. So non-exclusive, it's going to be effective upon receipt. So cancellations are, you know, cancellations can happen anytime for any reason. So they can cancel with you. And they just, you know, if they send you an email saying, hey, I don't want to work with you anymore. I found this other one and I'm done working with you. That is effective upon receipt. They can cancel that. Or you can write in how many days after receipt. Now, because we said that this is an exclusive agreement and we want to make sure these are exclusive agreements, then this exclusive cancellation is effective 30 days after receipt. So if they say, hey, I want to cancel with you, and they turn around and try and get into a contract with the listing agent because they think they're going to get a better deal, you're still entitled to that because the cancellation isn't effective for 30 days after receipt. So this is what they're signing on and they're agreeing to. This next part is about financial information. So again, this is all new, but I think this is really helpful to know at the beginning of your whole transaction. So this says time to deliver buyer personal financial information. So the default is within 5 days, or if you put another date on here from the execution of this agreement, and there's an additional CAR form. So this is saying, if you're asking, hey, do you have a down payment? Do you have proof of, or do you have a down payment? Do you have money to pay me? Do you have money for closing costs and all that kind of stuff? And they say, oh, yes, I have $10 million. Great. What they're agreeing to is they're going to give you that proof of funds within 5 days. And if they're saying, actually, I don't have any money to pay you, I don't have any money for any of this, then you would check these off. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't pay and they don't have the money necessarily, but if they're saying, hey, I don't want to pay you, I only want to do this if the seller is going to pay, then that falls within this too. The buyer doesn't have sufficient funds to pay broker, whether it's because they don't want to or because they can't, doesn't really matter. That's what this box is checked for. And then buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. So historically, the VA loans specifically did not allow for the buyer to pay compensation. And they've already amended that temporarily. I think they probably will put that into effect permanently with these new changes that have come about. As far as I know, that's the only loan product that doesn't allow it, but just keep that in mind. So if the seller is offering compensation to pay the buyer, that doesn't actually go as a credit to the loan costs. That just goes as part of the buyer obligation. So they're saying, I'm going to give you $12,000, $25,000, whatever it is, and buyer, you choose to do whatever you want with that. Well, the buyer is obligated now. They're saying they're agreeing that that money will go to pay you. Now, in the past, and still moving forward, what's going to happen is that they could also say this is going to go toward closing costs. Now, closing costs for the loan and for title and for fees and all of that kind of stuff, it actually can't exceed a certain limit if they have a loan. And so loans limit that to whatever the closing costs are. So if they're saying, hey, we want $100,000 credit, but the closing costs are only $20,000, they're going to be limited to only $20,000. So this compensation to the broker is outside of that. They're not limited by their closing costs. So the seller could credit them, 2.5%, 3%, 25,000, whatever it is for compensation for their buyer's agent. And separately, they could also give them $20,000 or whatever it is in closing costs. So there are a couple of things that are at play here. Mostly you don't need to worry about that until you're in a transaction, but that's what this part is for. It's just explaining and again, getting on the same page saying, hey, I don't have the money for it. So now you're going to know what to look for. You're going to look for those places. You're going to try and get your buyer to pay. No, you're going to try and get the seller to pay for your compensation. And then here are other terms. If you put other terms in here, like, anything that you wanted to put in here, that's where you would put other terms. Now, the rest of this is all just explaining what's above. So I want you to read through that because that's going to be important that you read through. Down here is just a repeat of what you put in above. So you can see the 45%, which again is kind of a wild, outlandish number. And whatever you put in here, it's just because we want to make sure that the buyers are very aware of what it is that we're getting. That's the whole name of this game, is transparency. And so we want to make sure that we're being very transparent and these forms are making it clear. And then again, remember, buyer Brenda has already filled this out. So she's already down here. And then email address, all of that good stuff is here. I like to have them put this in because then I can just send this whole thing to my TC and they can have all of this information, or escrow or whatever. They already have all this information. And then your information as the agent. Again, you can put this in your templates. So you would put your office address and your email and phone number, all of that good stuff. All right. So in this bundle comes also a buyer investigation advisory. Is just saying that your broker recommends that you complete inspections. Broker compensation advisory is saying that the buyer is agreeing that the broker can be represented, might be dual agency, all of these things, fully negotiable. We agree. It's just understanding what they're signing. Possible representation of more than one buyer and seller. This all comes in the bundle. So now we're going to go to the next form. So remember, we talked about how we were going to do the BRBC, and now we're going to talk about the PSRA. This PSRA is when you are wanting to show them a couple of properties, and again, they've said, I don't want to sign an exclusive agreement with you. I don't want to be tied to you for, $25,000 when I just met you. So you can say, okay, well, why don't we go ahead and fill out this smaller, shorter form. This is only 3 pages, as opposed to that long document with a whole huge bundle and everything. So again, this pulls from the things that we've already written above. And if you have your templates in place, it'll pull from that. But this would be like, again, if you meet somebody online, if you meet somebody at an open house and you say, hey, this one might not work for you, but what about one down the street? Let's go check it out today. So this is for use with prospective buyer for up to 3 houses or other properties only. And so if you're going to show them 5 houses, then this isn't what you would use. You would probably use a BRBC or something like that. So just keep this in mind that this is only up to 3 properties. So what I would say is that for me, I like to go out and offer showing, like if I don't know somebody, I'll go and show them a couple of properties. I'll go and show them a couple of properties, probably a max of 3. And then I'll say, okay, the next step is to sit down and have a buyer consultation where we talk about what you can afford, what, do you have a lender? Maybe we need to get you pre-approved. We talk about how you're going to pay, what you're going to pay, all of that kind of thing. We talk about the ins and outs and the specifics. And then at that point, that's when we're going to sign an exclusive agreement where we're saying we're going to work together forever. Not really forever, for 3 months. And so I'm going to have that conversation. So notice how I'm kind of like dropping in some conversations as we go. Take note of that because these are some of the conversations you're going to need to get comfortable with. So again, we're going to do the date prepared is today. We have 3 property addresses, 123 Main Street, and whatever we want to put in there. So the showing of a tour or property. So this is saying that I'm agreeing to show the property and I have a right to represent for this property. So it's a non-exclusive agreement. So it's only for the properties listed up here. So it doesn't even have an option of being exclusive. This by default is a non-exclusive agreement. So I can show them these properties and then they can turn around and go see 3 more properties with another agent. And if they decide on one of those properties, I am not eligible for any kind of compensation there, even though I showed them these properties. The terms of representation is what we're going to talk about here. So the representation period, so maybe you're taking them for a weekend. So you say the 16th through the 19th. This is just for an example. Or upon completion of resulting transaction. So that's going to be, like if they say, yes, we want to put an offer on this, at the completion of that transaction, that's when this will expire. Also, it says not to exceed 30 days. So it's meant to be a short-term this is meant to be a short-term transaction or document. So amount of compensation, again, you choose whatever the compensation is. And this, I'm going to put 45% just for funsies. And this, again, is a really good time to have your conversation with your clients. I always tell them, I want to try and see if we can get this compensated from the seller. But if the seller can't compensate it, won't compensate, do you have the money? Are you able? Do you have the funds to be able to compensate? And if they say yes, great, no problem. When they sign this, they're agreeing to that. If they say, no, I really don't have any of those funds, that's when we go back to those other that's when we go back to that other BRBC and say, they don't have the funds for this. So now, here's the thing. We're not necessarily going to say, then we're only going to look at houses that the seller is agreeing to pay a compensation, but we are going to let them know that we're going to try and get the seller to pay it. And if they won't, then they probably can't write the offer on that because they can't afford basically all their closing costs. And so this is a good conversation to have. We want them to understand that they can't just leave us and go talk to the listing agent because they can see if they can get a better deal. They're, number one, probably not going to be able to get a better deal necessarily. And number two, we want to make sure that they understand that that it's important for them to be represented separately. So that's one of the conversations that I want to have with them, is to get them to understand the importance of this. So I want to make sure that they understand that, you know, even if they go and try and get a lower price, you get what you pay for. Because when you go to the listing agent to be represented by the listing agent, their first and foremost fiduciary responsibility is to their seller. And so they're not going to be looking out for your buyer. They're not going to be looking out for your best interest. They're going to be looking out for their seller's best interest. And so it's really important that you are represented separately from the seller so that you can have your interests represented as well. So get comfortable with that conversation when they say, why would I want somebody else to represent me when I can just go over to the seller and get them to represent me? Well, you don't want that. And the reason is because you want to be equally represented. And if you go to the listing agent, you're not going to be equally represented. Now, of course, if you're on the listing agent side, you can tell them, my main fiduciary duty is to my seller. And if we have a separate agreement, then you're my client too, and I will equally represent you. However, you can't have cross conversations that don't benefit each other, or that do benefit each other. Even still, you have to be very, very careful when you do that. Can it be done, dual agency? Absolutely. But you have to be really careful. So again, this is saying the payments received by the broker, that if they get any payments, then the buyer is saying, yes, you can pay that obligation. Cancellation is, the default is upon receipt, or you can change it to 15 days or something like that. So again, I might put like 10 days after or something, just to say, you know, just to help avoid if they're trying to be shady and they're saying, hey, I'm done with you because I want to go into this open house and use this agent. That's shady, and I'm already doing work for you. So you may want to do that, or you can leave this as effective upon receipt of cancellation. And then other terms you can write in there too. And then, of course, all explanation and then getting it signed. So make sure that you fill out all this information about you and get your client to sign it. The next one we're going to look at is the open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. So this one is confusing to some people, and this is totally optional. But again, this is what your broker determines is optional or non-optional, or whatever. So this is if you're hosting an open house. This is a document that basically says, I am representing the seller. You're coming in, and I am not going to represent you unless we have a separate agreement. So it says here, the visitor intends to look at the property, but the agent does not represent the visitor unless otherwise agreed in writing. The agent is not working and has not entered into a representation agreement with the visitor that would apply to the property. So communication with the agent is for the benefit of the seller. So here's where that little piece comes in. You can, if you're the listing agent, you can show this house, but it's to the benefit of the seller. So you can show a house to an unrepresented buyer, and all of the information that you're going to gain is for the benefit of the seller. So you can show a house if it benefits your seller to open the door and to bring in somebody who's not represented. You can answer a few questions, but you have to help. You need them to understand that you're there representing the seller. If they want you to represent you, then you need to have a separate agreement in writing. Communication with the agent are not confidential. If the visitor writes an offer on the property through the agent, at that time the agent will disclose if the agent and agent's broker represent the seller exclusively or both the seller and the visitor. So basically this is saying we're going to be transparent and we're going to let everybody know who we're working with. And if the visitor wants to be represented by the agent holding the open house, they would sign a separate representation agreement, such as the PSRA, which we just went over, or the BRBC. If they are in an exclusive relationship with another agent, it's not intended as solicitation. So this is kind of a helpful form to get people to sign: name, agent if any, email, phone. Pretty easy, pretty standard of what we would use for a typical sign-in, and it just kind of clears you of any of this confusing stuff. So I think that if you feel comfortable with this, again, it's not required by my brokerage. It may be required by yours, so you talk to them and find out. And then finally, the last one we're going to look at is the single party compensation agreement, or the Form SP. So we're going to, again, put the date prepared. The principal is going to be the buyer, Brenda, and the broker is going to be your broker. Oops, your brokerage. And then you have a property in mind. So this is for the property that you're talking about. In the county of whatever. Here's the property, 123 Main Street. And then this is going to talk about the compensation. So it's going to say principal agrees to pay broker, irrespective of agency relationships, either a percentage, so let's stick with our 45 outlandish percent, or a dollar amount. If principal enters into an agreement with another party to purchase, sell, lease, or exchange property during the period on these dates, provided the other party's completion of the transaction or is prevented from doing so by the principal, or in the case of a lease, enters into possession. So this is really just talking about like if you're doing a single party. So you're saying, I'm only going to represent for this one transaction. So representation: broker will act as agent for principal exclusively in any resulting transaction. Broker will act as dual agent, representing both principal and other parties. So this is the other party being like the seller. Confidential information, blah, blah, blah. You want to read that. Broker will act as agent for the other party exclusively in any resulting transaction. Principal agrees and understands. So this form is a form that you can fill out. I would rather fill out the PSRA instead of this, because it's a little more, this is if you're looking to represent like a for sale by owner, and then you also bring a buyer or something like that. So this is kind of a different form that you would use. So in general, you can use this for certain things, but you want to use the property showing and representation agreement when you're showing specific properties. And then you have fair housing stuff that's on here. And then we get to the end of our documents. Any questions on this before? I'm going to show you the templates. I remembered. Okay, so back when we're here, so we're in a transaction, but if you go to your dashboard and you're outside of your transaction, this is might be what it looks like. And up here is where it has your templates. So if I click on that, forms and checklists, I have all these different folders. I'm actually not sure if you would have these different folders, but basically if you do, you just want to go in, and mine has required purchase documents, mid-deal documents, helpful information, all of that kind of stuff. And then I can go into a purchase agreement, which is your offer, the BRBC, which is what we just looked at. Let's click on that. And now anything that I change in here is going to change on all of my documents. So you can see I have the buyer checked off just so I don't miss that. But I don't want to put a buyer name in here because I don't want the buyer name to be on all of my documents. But I have my brokerage, my brokerage license number, my name, my license number, and so on and so forth for the things that I want to be consistently in all the different documents. So you can see I have it checked off to exclusive. I have the different counties in here. The amount of compensation. I don't put this in because I actually have a menu of services. The menu of services lets them choose. So I say at you know, you'll get all of this stuff for this percentage. If you want more, it's all of this stuff for this percentage. If you want even more, it's all of this stuff for this percentage. And then they determine what percentage they want to pay. And then I would write that in. So I don't have a set amount that I write in because it's different for everybody based on what they choose. And then that's basically it that is already filled out on the templates. And if I go down here, I want to make sure all of this is filled out about my information. And that's going to be it because the rest is just read and sign. So there's nothing else that needs to be filled out. This all gets pulled from above, and that's the end of that. So, okay, good. The templates are really helpful because it makes it so that like the next time you go through it and do it, I would highly recommend to do a BRB or an RPA in your templates because that makes your offers so much easier, so much smoother. Change is inevitable. Growth is optional. I want to make sure you guys are embracing change because that is how we grow. So make sure that you're comfortable, confident with everything that we're going to be doing. All right, let's open it up for some Q&As. Questions. If you have questions, just unmute and jump on, or you can put it in the chat. If we don't have any questions, I have some questions that I have been hearing. So I will jump in and start asking some questions, and that might prompt you to think about other questions. So some common questions that I have heard are, how will I get paid? So we've talked about this. As working with the buyers, I've heard so many agents, mostly on Facebook, freaking out about, how am I going to get paid? The agents who are taking trainings like this and courses like this and understanding that this is not the end of the world are not asking the question, how am I going to get paid? So the reality is that you're still going to get paid because you can have a set minimum. You can say, my minimum is X percent. Your brokerage might have a set minimum of how much you can charge. But in general, you can't do price fixing. Like the state of California can't come out and say, here's a set minimum. But you can set a minimum for yourself. And your client can negotiate. And in that negotiation, you can say, no, I'm not going to accept less. Or you can say, yes, I will accept you less. It's totally up to you and what you want to do. So the way that you all get paid is the seller may agree to pay the buyer agent commission now, or compensation. We're getting away from the word commission and we're using compensation. So if the seller agrees to pay the buyer agent compensation, then the seller is paying the buyer obligation. So what you're hearing a lot, or what I'm hearing a lot in like the Facebook forums, is that brokerages are coming out and saying they're no longer allowing broker to broker compensation, meaning the listing brokerage is no longer paying the buyer's brokerage. What it is that the seller is going to pay the buyer. They're going to give a credit to the buyer, or they're going to agree to compensation to the buyer, and the buyer then is going to pay the brokerage, which is you. Then the brokerage pays you. Now, if you are getting it straight from your buyer, then your BRBC is going to go to escrow, and escrow is going to say, okay, well, then we are going to facilitate the agent getting paid because that's what the buyer agreed to. Now, one of the things I want to mention that we haven't mentioned yet is that you cannot get more than what you agree to. So if you say, okay, we're agreeing to 2.5%, but the seller is willing to pay 3%, you are not eligible for that extra 0.5%. You agreed to 2.5%, that's what you're getting. However, if you say, well, I'm going to get 3%, but the seller only is giving you 2.5%, number one, you can go back to your buyer and say, okay, well, you pay me that extra 0.5%. Or you can say, I'm not going to charge you that 0.5%, so we can modify the terms, and I only am going to charge you 2.5%, but the seller is going to pay for that 2.5%. So one way or another, you're going to get paid, but you have to come to an understanding with your buyer. The bottom line is it's about the transparency now. And so you want to make sure that you are communicating with your buyer and that they're understanding all these things, which means that you first have to understand all these things. All right, so question. Is it illegal if a visitor doesn't want to sign the visitor agreement? No, it's not illegal. Basically, all that visitor agreement is saying is that they're understanding that you don't represent them. And so if they don't want to sign, then that's fine. You don't have to give them very much information. All you need to do is give them information that's going to benefit your seller. So if it's going to benefit your seller to say, this home is a beautiful home. It has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. Look at the pool. Look at, the neighborhood, whatever. If that's going to benefit your seller, you can answer those questions. But if you start getting questions like, how many offers do you have? And all of that kind of stuff. If that's not going to benefit your seller, you don't need to tell them that. And so unless you're in a written agreement with them, with the buyer, and even then, if you're representing the seller, then you have to be careful about what kind of information you give. But once you're representing the buyer, then that's different. But with that visitor form, the OHNA, the OHNA, whatever they're calling it, with that form, all that's saying is that they understand that you are not trying to represent them and you are not representing them. You are representing the seller. So if they say, nope, I don't want to pay, I don't want to sign anything, they don't have to. It's the same thing as the sign-in sheets that we have now. It's just a little bit more kind of like a, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like a hold harmless kind of situation. All right, good question. Okay, so another question that I hear a lot is, can I even show a house to somebody without signing a contract? So most of the time, the context of this is a listing agent saying, well, what if I get a sign call and I have a listing and somebody says, hey, I want to see the house. Are you allowed to show them the house without getting a contract signed? And the answer to that is yes, you can show that house if it benefits the seller. So because you're working for the seller, everything you do needs to benefit your seller. So your seller and you are going to agree, more than likely, that showing the house to any buyer is going to be okay because that's going to benefit your seller. And so they're going to say, yes, the seller is going to say, yes, I agree. You should show the house to anybody who wants to see it. Okay, so you can show them that house. Now, where it gets a little dicey is you can't do something that triggers agency. So if you start to say, oh, do you have a lender? Oh, let me run some comps for you. Have you seen these other houses? That triggers agency. And that's when you need a signed contract. And so you can bring them into the house, show them the house as you're representing the seller. And that was kind of a question that a lot of people were saying, okay, so like if I get a phone call and they say, hey, I want to come see the house, basically you just then and there should be saying, just to be clear, I'm representing the seller unless you want to sign a separate agreement with me. So you're just up front saying, I'm representing the seller, just want to let you know. It's all about transparency. So now when you do need to sign the contract is if you bring them in and they say, actually, this one I don't want, but have you seen that house down the street? Can you show me that house? Now that's when you need to have a signed agreement with that other person. Or maybe if you find somebody on Facebook or YouTube or something like that, and they say, hey, I want to go see this house, before you show them a house, you need to have a signed agreement. So this question is usually in reference to if it's your listing, can you show a house without signing a contract? The answer to that is yes. If you are strictly working with the buyer, you cannot show them a house without a signed contract. Period. End of story. Number 3, what triggers the contract needing to be signed? So this is a good question, and this is actually detailed out in the BRBC. But basically, it's when you are doing agency work for them. So signing them up to an MLS drip campaign where they're just getting automated feed, that does not trigger it. However, if they start saying, hey, is this a good price for this? Should I get, like Can you run some comps for me? Can you go and look at it and give me a video tour? When you start doing research for a particular property and helping that client for a particular property, that is when the agency is triggered, and that's when a contract needs to be signed. So for sure, if you go and show a house, that needs to be signed. If you even do a virtual tour where you're FaceTiming them or do a video and send it to them, that's when you need to have a signed contract. If you start doing work for them for a property, so if you're starting to write offers, if you're asking questions of the seller, if you're running comps, that also triggers an agency relationship, and you should get a contract signed. Another question, how do I know if the seller is offering compensation? So now our MLSs have changed, mine at least, has changed to where the only thing in the MLS that says anything about compensation is the seller offering compensation, yes or no? That may even go away. We may have no idea if the seller is offering compensation, and at that point, we have to pick up the phone and have a conversation with every single listing agent. Well, that's what we needed to do before. That's what we've always needed to do. So is that the worst thing in the world? I think no. We pick up the phone and have a conversation, and that's how we know if the seller is offering compensation or not. Remember, all of this talk of compensation and are we allowed to talk about it? Are we allowed to write about it? Are we allowed to say anything about it? It's all specific to the MLS. So our CAR forms, our MLS, all of that is under NAR. That's why all of these are so specific about what can we say, what can't we say. So on the MLS, you cannot say anything. You cannot allude to anything about offering compensation. However, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, then I can have a separate landing page that says, hey, we're offering compensation. Absolutely, you can do that. What you can't do is you can't go to the MLS and say, hey, go to the landing page to hear more about compensation, or go to the landing page for something really enticing. You can't even allude to it, but you can have a flyer. If you have an open house, you can have a flyer that says, here's a percentage that we're offering. You absolutely, during a phone call, can say yes, and they're offering X percent. It's just on the MLS and on the forms. You can't put anything. Now, of course, on the RPA, if you're writing an offer, you're saying, hey, we're going to request that the seller pays X percent or a flat fee or whatever it is. That can be written in. That can be, because you need to make sure that you have a contractual agreement. But on the MLS, you can't put that. And on any other documentation on the MLS, you cannot refer to it. So the best way of knowing if if the seller is offering compensation is to pick up the phone and ask. So is it steering to only show houses that offer compensation? Technically, if you're saying, I refuse to even show you a house that won't offer me compensation, yes, that would be steering. But this is where the conversations with your clients come in. Now, number one, you're not going to be able to do an MLS search that says only show me houses that offer compensation. That's not going to be a thing because it's an optional field. So already I'm seeing a lot of houses that don't have that. It doesn't show that. And so what you're wanting to do is you want to have the conversation with your client to say, okay, in the event that the seller is not willing to, or maybe they get so many offers that they were willing to, but now they have a bunch of offers that are saying, hey, you don't need to offer us compensation. Now, buyer, what do you want to do? The ball is in your court. Do you want to pay me my compensation directly, or do you want to still request it of them? Well, if we're going to request it of them, they're going to say no. So do we even want to write an offer? This is the conversation that we're having. And if your buyer says, yes, I want to write an offer, great, write an offer on their behalf. It's probably going to get rejected. But at least we know, and at least we're having that conversation with our clients. So we're still going to be showing them houses. We're still going to be letting them know, hey, this seller is offering compensation. This seller is not. So buyer, you're going to have to pay out of pocket to be represented by me if you want to do that. Now, are we going to lose business this way? that's yet to be determined. I don't know if we're going to lose business. I think we'll lose some business. But here's the thing. This is why our job is to go through and get as many leads as we can. That's why our main job is lead generation, is because number one, if somebody's not willing to sign a document, then I don't want to work with them. That tells me right off the bat what their motivation is and if I want to work with them and use my time, effort, and energy to do that. So I'm going to understand, is this something I want to do or is it not? So getting them to sign this is going to be easy enough. And if they're unwilling to sign it, then we're done. We don't even need to continue. I can still send them an MLS strip. And if they say, hey, I really like this one, I want to go see it, great. Now I send them that one property sheet and say, hey, sign off on this and let's go check it out. What I would do and what I will do, haven't done this yet, but what I will do is I'll have a couple of those forms, a couple of BRBCs, so that when I go meet people at a property to show them one or two houses, I say, okay, I just need to have you sign this before we go in. This is what it's explaining. This is what we're talking about. Hopefully the seller is going to be able to pay. If not, do you have fun? We have that conversation right then and there. All right, let's move on to number 6. Do I need to be sure another agent has a written agreement with their client before showing them a house? Now, again, this is a question that a lot of listing agents have, is that do I need to do any due diligence to make sure that the agent has a signed agreement? And the answer with that, according to my brokers, is no. If they're saying that they have an agreement with somebody else, that's on them. They figure it out. And so we don't need to be policing other agents to say, well, show me your signed documents, your signed BRBC. We don't need to do that. We just need to make sure that with our clients, we have those signed agreements. So conversations that we need to be having and get really comfortable with are the finance conversations. I think the finance conversations are much more important than here, we need you to sign this, because that's the bigger picture. That's the bigger deal here, is that we're going to have a lot of people who are saying, well, I don't want to sign it. But you also have to remember that I think the vast majority of the public has no idea about this NAR settlement. We know it because it's been shoved down our throats for the last 6 months to a year to maybe longer than that. But the vast majority of people have no idea. Even my mom is really up on the news and what's going on with the real estate stuff because of me. She always sends stuff to me. Hey, did you hear this? Did you know this? And when I asked her what she knew about it, she knew nothing. She had never even heard about this. And so I think it's in the minds of the agents that they are the ones who are worried about all of this and how it's going to come down. But if we go as, business as usual, this is just a change that we are now needing to implement. It is what it is, and we let them know. That's where we need to come in as educators, and we let them know, okay, this is what you're signing. This is what this means. Either it's an exclusive agreement or it's only for this property. And here's what this means. Here's the compensation. Here's what I will get paid, and that I will try and get that paid by the seller. If the seller cannot pay, are you going to pay that? It'll come out of closing costs just like other closing fees, just like your down payment. Do you have money to do that? Do you have the financial backing to do that? If yes, great, sign here. If no, then that's when we say, okay, great. Now we're only going to be looking for houses where the seller offers that compensation. And if they say, no, I want to look at houses where the seller doesn't offer that compensation, great, no problem. And the offers that we submit, then we're going to have to figure out where that money's coming from. But some of your clients are going to be able to figure out how to get that money, because essentially it's just like them figuring out how to get a down payment, how to get closing costs. Do they need to sell a house? Do they need to bring in a cosigner? What is it that they need to do to get them to be able to buy this? This is just one more fee to get them to be able to buy this. And you're going to have some people who can't do it. And so by having this conversation up front, it helps them to understand what the process is. So the process, in my opinion, is you have this conversation by walking through these forms. The forms are now set up in a grid so that it's easy to walk through and say, this is what this means, this is what this means, this is what this means. Any questions? And ideally what we want to do is, if it's somebody we're meeting off the street, we say, okay, this is a couple of properties that we're going to go see. After this, let's set up a time to do a full buyer consultation where I walk you through the process. I walk you through what this looks like. I walk you through what you can expect. And then at the end of that, that's when we get the BRBC signed. And again, we just walk through the grid. This is what this means. This is what this means. This is the compensation. How do you feel about that compensation? How do you, how are we going to get there? Now, if you're like me and you have a menu of services, that makes it even an easier conversation, because I say, this is what I'm going to provide you. This is the work that I'm going to do for you. If you want more, here's how much it's going to be. If you want even more, here's how much that's going to be. Which one works best for you? And you let them choose. And then we have the conversation of, okay, so this is what we're agreeing to. So do you have the funds to cover that? But remember, I'm always going to try and get it covered by the seller. That's the conversation I want to have at first. I'm always going to try to get it covered by the seller. And if not, then the buyer's responsible to pay that. So the conversation is always just, where's it going to come from? All right. All right. And that is the end. Next week, we're talking about blowing up your sales, real estate agents' ultimate guide to social media domination. So make sure you're here with me 2 p.m. on Thursdays. Subscribe for here for my YouTube channel, where you can get past workshops. You can see things that we've talked about in the past, classes we've had, all that good stuff. So you can get that information. Well, I hope that helped. And remember, you're invited to join me live every Monday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where I will talk about topics that will move your business forward, and you can be there in real time asking your questions and getting them answered live. So join me in registering at the link in the description. And remember to like and subscribe so you get more videos just like this as soon as they come out. We'll see you in the next video.